Ruth, a story of hope. This is a series that we've been in for a couple of weeks now, and we're going to be in this series all the way up until Easter. And really, the teaching team, we came together as we processed, when we kick off the new year, what do we want to be teaching up until Easter? And we landed on the book of Ruth because the book of Ruth really is the story of hope. And I'm excited today because it's where we begin to get a glimpse of the hope that we're going to find throughout this book. Now, last week, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, they started back towards Judah, which was Naomi's homeland. Naomi was an Israelite, and about 10 years earlier, she had left her homeland with her husband and her two sons, and they traveled to Moab because there was a famine in the land. And their tragedy struck, and then God's favor seemed to shine again on the land of Israel, and they began to get crops again, so the famine seemed like it was over. And because Naomi had nothing really tying her to Moab, her husband and her sons had passed away, she grabbed her daughters-in-law and they began to make a journey back towards her homeland in Judah. And somewhere along the way, as they're traveling, Naomi's like, okay, there's no reason for my daughters-in-law to follow me to my homeland. There's nothing there for them. There's nothing that I can provide for them. Surely I'm under God's judgment, so anywhere that they go with me, they will incur the collateral damage, if you will, of God's judgment on me. So somewhere in the journey, she stops and she's like, listen, you should go back home to your parents' house. It's there that you might be able to remarry and find security for your lives. So go back home and start your lives over again. Orpah finally listened to her, and she's like, Naomi's right. I am probably just going to go back home. The scriptures say that she goes back home to her people and to her gods. But Ruth takes a different path. Ruth says, absolutely not. I am not going back. Like, there's no chance that I'm turning around now and heading back to Moab. Her determination is what Naomi sees. Determination is like this firm resolve that she's going to continue on. Naomi recognized there's no changing Ruth's mind, that she is sold out and set in motion. She is going with her to Judah. She has made a firm decision, and this firm decision is highlighted in verse 16 of chapter 1. And this is what Ruth declares to Naomi. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. It is this firm declaration that Ruth had given her heart to Naomi's God, that she had surrendered her life. This is a conversion moment, or a declaration of the conversion that had made, that Ruth decided that Naomi's God, Yahweh, creator God, the one who created all, would be her God. Therefore, God's people were going to be her people. Ruth was definitely loyal to Naomi, for sure. But Ruth's loyalty to Naomi was first grounded in Ruth's loyalty to Naomi's God. She wasn't just a good friend. She wasn't just a good daughter-in-law. She was somebody who had surrendered to the God Yahweh, Israel's God, and that was directing her steps forward. That's where her loyalty came from. As you can imagine, as a pastor, over the years, I've had the honor of walking with people through some very challenging times. They walk through challenging seasons of relationship. They walk through challenging times of diagnosis, loss of job, like you name it, just challenging times that we as humans all wrestle with. And during these times, I often see there's this turning towards the Lord. There's this turning towards the Lord and beginning to maybe dust off some habits that had been forgotten, right? Become a bit more committed to gathering together with the church on a regular basis, spending more time in prayer and more time reading the Bible. And I always love to see that in people's lives, right? For some reason, tragedy or challenge seems to promote that in the lives of people. I love to see it when it's not that, but oftentimes that's what's kind of the impetus before it, right? And every time I see this turning towards the Lord, my hope and my prayer is that it's a genuine turning towards the Lord. Their heart is really softening for the things of God, not just transactional. And I always find myself praying for them like, Lord, would you help this to be a true, genuine surrendering of their lives to you and not just an act of transaction, not just using you like a genie in a bottle. It's so easy when walking through difficulty and tragedy to say, oh yeah, I do remember there's this God and he is supposed to be faithful. And what would it look like if I began to do some religious activities? Maybe, just maybe, I could twist his arm into doing what I want him to do for me. And I've seen it over and over again. And it's always like, I'm kind of take the position like, I love the turning. I love, it seems as though heart softening, but time will tell if this is a true conversion, if this is a legitimate turning towards the Lord, desiring to follow him, or if this is just simply transactional. I'm going to do religious duties in order to make God do what I want him to do. And if he doesn't do what I want him to do, then I'm just going to go back to doing things the way I've always done them. I see it over and over again. In fact, it's really heart-wrenching when you see God respond in really cool ways in their lives, but then life just kind of takes over and they get back into the same rhythms, and pretty soon what they thought was important in the midst of tragedy becomes unimportant along the way, and God then still gets sidelined. So what I really like about this story of Ruth is we can read it in one sitting and we can see this trajectory of her life, this humility that comes with her along the way. See, because truly turning to the Lord, rather, it requires humility. Truly turning your heart and your attention to the Lord requires you to be a humble person. You cannot surrender your life to God without first humbling yourself and recognizing who you are compared to him. So often we want to be God and we live our lives as God, but a heart that truly surrenders to God says, I am not God. I'm going to put God in his rightful place. I'm going to surrender him and follow him with my life. So truly surrendering to God or truly turning to the Lord requires humility, because humility is the soil for God's provision. That's our sermon in a sentence today. That's the sentence that I want you to carry with you out of this place today. Simply this: humility is the soil for God's provision. It's for his provision, like physically, and for his provision spiritually. We must be people of humility to recognize God's provision for our lives. And we're going to see this so clearly, again, as we continue to work our way through the book of Ruth, but it begins to kick off here in the second chapter in the first few verses. Let's read them together. And this is what it says. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. One day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. As it happened, she found herself working in the field that belonged to Boaz, a relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Now, that singular detail that's now been mentioned twice in 3 verses is going to make more sense as we work our way through the book of Ruth together. But I want to hone in on this. One day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields and pick up stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." As always, when you're reading scripture, in order to get a full picture of what's going on, you have to understand the context that it's written in. See, in the passage that we're in today, there's a legal backdrop to it that gives us more clarity when we read the text with the backdrop in place. So what I want to do is I want us to go back, like we've done now a couple of times, to 2 different books in the Old Testament that come before Ruth that give us some context or give us the backdrop that we're meant to read these 3 verses in front of. The books are Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Let me give you a little bit of context for the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy. Both of these books, they expand and apply the law that God had given. So God chooses his people. They get enslaved in Egypt. God rescues them out of slavery after 400 years. And then he sets them at the base of Mount Sinai. You can read about this in the book of Exodus. And this particular time is at chapter 20 of the book of Exodus. They're at the base of Sinai, and God gives them these 10 commandments, or the Decalogue. We're very familiar with, these are the 10 commandments that God gives his people Israel and says, if you're going to be my people, these are the rules. These are the laws. These are the things that will set you apart from all other nations. And then in the book of Leviticus, see, in Exodus chapter 20, we just get 10 quick statements, 10 quick commands. And then the book of Leviticus, it kind of unfolds it. It dives deeper. It gets down into particulars of the law. It helps Israel understand how a holy God can live with an unholy people. So it really begins to drill down on the details of it. And then the book of Deuteronomy, Israel is in Moab after spending 40 years wandering around in the desert, and a whole generation had passed away. And before they go into the promised land that God had given them, he has them in the plains of Moab, where Moses gives several sermons, several speeches, helping Israel understand this is what it will look like to be God's people when you move into your promised land. So let's take a look at Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 and 10. This is what it says. It says, when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It is the same with your grape crop. Don't strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines. Do not pick up the grapes that fall on the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner living among you. I am the Lord your God. If we flip to the right just a little bit, we get to Leviticus chapter 23. And verse 22 says this: when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigner living among you. I am the Lord your God. See, twice in the book of Leviticus, God lays out this plan that he has for the foreigner, the orphan, the widow, the most vulnerable. And he wants to make sure that his people recognize that that's God's plan to help take care of them. He says, don't grab everything that you can and keep it for yourself. And what is his reasoning for this? He says it twice. He ends both of these commands with the same statement: because I am the Lord your God. What he's trying to help Israel recognize that he is the one who provides for them. You see, when we think we have to provide for ourselves, we take all that we can, we hoard it and keep it to ourselves, and we don't give it out to anybody else. If you don't believe me, I just want you to look back to 2020 and the toilet paper shortage. We were all like, I cannot believe people are doing this. And then you saw toilet paper at Costco, you're like, I'm gonna get a few rolls. I'm just gonna stock up while I'm here, right? We grab it all for ourselves. And what God was trying to establish in the heart of his people before they entered into the promised land was, listen, your provision, your sustenance is not based on your abilities. I am the Lord, your God. I am the one who will provide for you. And then if we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 through 22. Again, this is they're on the plains of Moab getting ready to enter into the promised land, and Moses is reminding them again of what it looks like to live as God's people in God's promised land. He said, when you are harvesting your crops and you forget to bring a bundle of grain in from the field, don't go back and get it. Leave it for the foreigners, the orphans, and widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. When you beat the olives from your olive trees, don't go over the boughs twice. Leave the remaining olives for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, don't glean the vines after they have been picked, meaning don't go through and pick it and then go back through and pick it once again. It says, leave the remaining grapes for the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. Then he says this, remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. That is why I am giving you this command. See, now when you take these two, you take the law that God's given, and you take this story in the book of Ruth, and you overlap them with one another, all of a sudden there's timeless truth that pops off of the page for us that will help us to live as God's people in 2025 or 2026. How'd that happen? You take the backdrop and you put it in the back, and you take the story we're in now and you put it over the front, and all of a sudden what pops off the page will help you and I live as God's people in the here and now. It will help us live as God's people in our neighborhoods. It will help us live as God's people in our workplaces. It will help us live as God's people in our families of origin. This is so incredibly hopeful. When they begin to come into focus, they help us to see that our story is actually a story of hope as well. As Thomas said a little bit earlier, maybe you walked in here today feeling very hopeless about your situation. My hope is that through the law and the story and the truths that come out of it, that you'll begin to see hope again. That you'll walk out of this place hopeful. And one of the main reasons that you have to be hopeful is the first truth that pops off the page for me is that God cares for the vulnerable. Like you cannot read Leviticus and then into Deuteronomy and then read the story of Ruth without recognizing that God cares for the vulnerable. He cares for them. You see, God established his people to care about the poor as well. Remember, we as humans were created in the image and likeness of God, meant to be his image bearers throughout all of the world. So you can imagine as God establishes a people for himself, it was called Israel. He says, I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing to others. So if God has a heart that cares about the vulnerable, it only makes sense that as his image bearers, that he created laws to help us care about the vulnerable as well, to care about them. He's like, there will be foreigners among you. You see, Ruth had the legal right to go out into the fields and glean, pick up what had been left behind by the harvesters. God, he says, I want you as my people to also care about the vulnerable among you so that those who are the most vulnerable will begin to see me through you. See, God establishes this law at the very beginning. And it's interesting to me, Ruth seems to have known God's heart for the vulnerable. I don't know who told her about this law. I don't know how she got the idea. It just simply says, one day she says to Naomi, let me go out into the field and glean behind the harvesters. And Naomi's like, yeah, you should go do that. You see, in Ruth participating in the very thing that God had created for people like her, foreigner, vulnerable, poor, and in need, by her participating, what is she saying? She's like, I trust that God has this all under control. Ruth understood the heart of God who loved the vulnerable among them. And when we read about the vulnerable, it is so important for us to recognize all of us are vulnerable. We are all vulnerable in this room. We can all put ourselves in Ruth's spot. You know what's required to put ourselves in Ruth's spot? Humility. But you know what? Humility is the soil for God's provision. And when we recognize ourselves as vulnerable, we won't let the current comfort that we have lull us into thinking that we are our own providers. And that's the Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 22, where he says, remember, you were slaves in Egypt. God did not want his people to forget. They were going to go into a promised land, and it was a land, the scriptures say, flowing with milk and honey. It was going to be posh. It was going to be beautiful. They were going to have everything they ever needed. And God knew that they get into that land and comfort would lull them to sleep. And he's like, do not forget where you came from. Don't forget. You didn't create all this for yourself. I am the Lord, your God. I'm the one that provided it for you. I'm the one that brought you out of slavery and gave you the promised land. Don't forget where you came from. As people who are followers of Jesus, let us never forget that we are vulnerable people in absolute desperate need for God. We don't just breathe because God breathed. We continue to breathe because God continues to breathe. We are desperate for him. Let us never forget where he rescued us from. Let us never, with hubris, think that we are our own providers, but always trusting God to be the one who provides for us. Not only does God provide for us, he also wants to use us to provide for others. We're going to get into this more in the next couple of weeks, but it seems like it would be a mistake to move on beyond this without simply saying, God told his people, when you're gleaning your fields, don't take all of it. And how often are we so strapped that we have no ability to help the people around us? We've ran our finances so thin, we have no ability to help somebody who is suffering and hurting around us. And if we're going to be God's people, then we have to recognize God wants to use us to help those who we can help. That we should not be people who hoard to ourselves, but we should live life in such a way that there is extra, that there's something in order to provide for somebody else around us who is in need. Why? Because that is the character of God. And with God's character in mind, we see that Ruth's loyalty to this God is not misplaced. That she has anchored her loyalty to the right place, Yahweh, the God of the Bible. And in this text and in this story and with the law transposed behind it, we see that Ruth not only is God a God that cares for the vulnerable, Ruth is one who is dependent. Ruth is dependent, but she's not despondent. I love this about Ruth. She's not despondent. She's not helpless. She's not just sitting in her house waiting for something to arrive. She's not just waiting for an Uber driver to show up and bring her some food. It says one day, she said to Naomi, I'm going to go out in the fields and I'm going to glean from what the harvesters have left behind. Ruth goes to the fields. There is something about doing what you can do. There's something about putting one foot in front of the other, taking one step at a time, recognizing what is in your ability, what is in your control, what you can do to move the needle, how you can respond, how you can get up and go do something. Like there's just something about doing that. God's provision often comes when you keep doing what you can do. There's no crazy, wow, miraculous, like fireworks kind of miracles in the book of Ruth. It's just common work. Just people doing the best thing that they know how, trusting that God is going to be faithful, and then watching God work behind the scenes to be what he has claimed he's always been, a faithful God. So what does Ruth do? She gets up. She goes to the field. There's a secularized version of this idea about doing what you can do. It's often attributed to Thomas Edison. And it goes like this: opportunity is often disguised as hard work, so most people don't recognize it. And it's important when you're in the midst of a challenging time to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Keep progressing forward. That's what Ruth does. When she goes to the fields, she doesn't go to the fields with entitlement. She goes to the fields with humility. She goes there with humility. She is dependent on the kindness of God and the obedience of God's people. And we see that when she says, I'm going to go to the field. I'm going to glean behind the harvesters to pick up whatever they've dropped behind if someone is kind enough to let me do it. Ruth didn't jump out in that field and say, hey, listen up. I know what your God has told you. I'm here to follow through with it. So start dropping stuff because I'm going to pick it up. It's not what she does. She sets out on a journey. She has no idea necessarily where she's going. She goes out to the fields like, if somebody's just simply kind enough, I'm going to pick up some grain behind them, and I'm going to take it back to my family. She doesn't go with entitlement. She goes with humility, dependent on the kindness of God and the obedience of God's people. And then the author throws us for a loop. This is what he says. As it happened. As it happened. In fact, in the Hebrew, it's a very interesting play on the words. It literally says, her chance chanced. Her chance chanced, and she ended up in the field of this man named Boaz. She just happened to be there, right? In today's language, you'd be like, coincidentally. Like, she just happened to show up. Like, as luck would have it, she wandered into the field of Boaz. I love the way J. Vernon McGee, old pastor, Bible teacher, radio host, he talks about this passage in a sermon that he does. And he says, like, this is an important part of the story. Because if Ruth doesn't end up in Boaz's field, you can tell the wise men there's no need to take the journey to Bethlehem because the Savior ain't being born there. You can tell the shepherds, go ahead and stay out in the field with your flocks because there ain't no baby in the manger. Like, none of this happens unless Ruth ends up in the field of Boaz. And it just so happens. The author is doing this on purpose. The author's doing this because you've already read enough about who this God of the Bible is, the Israel God. You've already read enough, so you get to this spot in the story, and as it happens, her chance, she ends up in the field of Boaz, and it's like the author wants you to go, no way. Not a chance. Like, I believe in coincidence every now and then, but there is way too many things that had to align for her to end up in the field of Boaz, the one who could provide for her. It's like the author wants you to say, that's more than coincidence. That's providence. That is God working behind the scenes to bring all of the pieces together for his plan to work out exactly the way he planned it. This isn't coincidence. This isn't happenstance. This isn't just as luck has it. This is the sovereign God of the universe working the details out behind the scene in order for this lonely foreigner Moabite woman to end up in the field of a man who had the resources in order to take care of her needs. I remember probably 20 years ago now, roughly, Heidi and I were in a season where finances were very tight, youth pastoring in University Place, trying to do some hustle side work on the side, carpentry, and you know those seasons where ends, it just seems like you can't get ends to meet together. It's just like it was so straining and so difficult. It felt like a grind all the time. And we had some friends who had sold their house and they were getting ready to buy another house, and both deals were supposed to close on the same day. And if you've ever done a real estate deal before, you know how scary that situation is. And the worst of the worst happened. Their house closed that they sold, and the house that they bought fell through. And they found themselves without a home. And as is our practice, we opened up ours. We said, why don't you guys come live with us? We'll figure this out. They're like, it's going to be for a while. We're like, we don't care. You are welcome in our home anytime. So they moved in with 2 or 3, they have 4 kids now, but I don't remember how many they had. They had 3 at that point, right? So we had 3, they had 3. So I'm not going to do the math on stage. I'm really bad at that, but it's a lot of people in a small house. 1,800 square foot house. There wasn't nearly enough bedrooms or bathrooms, but they move into the house and we're doing life together. I remember Heidi and I were having a conversation one night before we went to sleep and just talking about how it's so hard. Finances are really struggling right now. And I remember one of us saying the only reason why we're making ends meet right now is because Brian and Michelle have moved into our house. And even as the words came out of one of our mouths, it was like a light bulb went off. Like, let's not think that this is coincidence. Let's recognize this as the providence of God, his hand caring for us in every season. There was nothing major and miraculous. We didn't go out of the mailbox and open up and there was a $1,000 check in there. No, it was just simply some people moved into our house. They did what they could do and they began to help provide for us in this really challenging season. It would have been foolish to walk through that season thinking, what a coincidence. It wasn't. It was God working in the background to provide the way he says he will always provide. And the third timeless truth that we see in this story is this man named Boaz. See, Boaz is who God used in this story to bring about all that they needed, to provide all that they needed. See, Boaz is God's instrument to provide in this story. And we're introduced to Boaz as a wealthy and influential man. That's what the New Living Translation translates, that he is a wealthy and influential man. If you read other translations that say that he is a worthy man. And this worthy is probably a little bit better because he was influential, he was wealthy, but it kind of pigeonholes what they mean by worthy here. There's more depth to this word worthy. More is like he had the moral character and he had the material wealth in order to provide for Ruth, Naomi, and the family. So Boaz, this worthy man, he steps into to sight. And it's interesting because remember, we talked about this backdrop a few weeks ago, how in this time, everyone did what they saw right in their own eyes. So in this time period, Boaz sticks out, right? He sticks out like a shining light. Yes, God had provision for the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow, but people were not obeying God at this time. They were doing whatever they saw fit in their own eyes. So if they thought, I'm going to glean my fields all the way to the edges, that's what they did. If they thought, don't you dare leave grapes on the vine, go back and get them, they gleaned the grapes again. So this idea that Naomi was going to go out into the field and glean was hopes that there was somebody who was still obedient to God, was still engaging in life the way God designed them to. And what does she run into? A man named Boaz who sticks out like a shining light. But here's the thing. It's easy to look at Boaz, and we're going to spend time looking at Boaz. And I do think that Boaz is a great example for us to follow in terms of how we live out this faith in real life. But when we look at Boaz, we're supposed to look through Boaz, and we're supposed to look at Jesus. Boaz was a worthy man. Boaz did have the means to provide for Ruth and Naomi. But we're supposed to look through Boaz, and we're supposed to see Jesus, who is the most worthy man. The man who has the means to provide for every one of our needs. That's why the book of Philippians chapter 4 says, my God, who will supply all of my needs according to his riches and glory in Jesus Christ. Everything that we need is found in Jesus. Jesus is the worthy man who has all that we could ever want and all that we could ever need. So this morning, maybe you're here and you're a follower of Jesus, but your circumstances have you blinded to the fact that God's got this under control. Or maybe you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus. And you're wondering, I don't know how I'm going to survive. I don't know how I'm going to make it. I don't know how I'm going to make sense of this life. I don't know how I'm going to find purpose. I don't know any of that. Listen, Jesus is the answer for all of us in every season, in every situation. If you have physical needs, Jesus is the answer. If you have financial needs, Jesus is the answer. If you have spiritual needs, Jesus is the answer. He is the most worthy man who will care for every need that we have. As we wrap up, God's blessing often comes through ordinary, everyday work. Just ordinary, everyday work. Again, there's no big firework moments of miracles in the book of Ruth. It's just normal, everyday work. And humility prepares us to receive them. Recognizing that every good gift comes from the Father. That is a place of humble submission. And when we're in a place of humble submission, when we receive these blessings, this provision, receive as God provides for us, we're able to receive it for exactly what it is. And when we serve God faithfully and quietly, we cultivate hearts that are ready to receive and recognize his provision for us. Humility is the soil in which hope and redemption grow. Hope and redemption grow out of the soil of humility. So, stay faithful in the fields God has put you in. And stay humble enough to recognize his hand when provision comes. I have two takeaways. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to bounce out of here. Number one is this: check your posture. Are you in a place of dependence or a place of entitlement? What is your posture towards God? How are you receiving him and his blessings? Number two, do what you can do, faithfully and humbly. Whatever spot you're in, whatever predicament you find yourself in, do what you can do and do it faithfully and do it humbly. And I'm going to guess we're going to have opportunity to live both of those out this week in our everyday lives. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word. It is so transformational if we come to it with a posture that says, God, I want to be transformed by it. Help us to be a humble people, recognizing your hand of provision in every area of our lives, God. In fact, help us this week to just maybe recount all of the ways that you've been faithful in the past and remind ourselves that gives us a great portfolio to know that you're going to take care of us in the future as well. We love you. We're grateful for your love for us. We pray these things in your name, Jesus.